I am a first-year student at the program, and I can tell you we are extremely thrilled that Liz had the time to be here. She is a designer, social innovator, and academic, as well as an expert on sustainable design in challenged urban environments. She was recently among the inaugural class of Innovators in residence at IDEO.org, a nonprofit IDEO spinoff dedicated to global poverty reduction through design and innovation. Previously, Liz was a design director at Public Architecture, a national nonprofit mobilizing designers to create social change. She teaches at the California College of the Arts and is a member of the school's Urban Lab. A senior fellow of the Design Futures Council, Liz has spoken and written widely on design for environmental and social impact. Liz earned her Bachelor of Arts in Architecture from Wellesley College and Master of Architecture from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. Liz is addicted to learning about cultures and has traveled extensively, including a 10-country sojourn through sub-Saharan Africa on a Thomas J. Watson Fellowship. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you guys for being here today. I wanted to start off by just asking a question, or two questions rather. How many of you guys consider yourselves to be experts? One person, okay. How many of you guys consider yourselves to be designers? More, that's good. So in reality, all of you should have raised your hands to both questions, because you are all experts in a way, and you are also all designers. Anytime you have, I imagine that the outfits that you've put together today, you've designed, well, some of you have designed in some way, or the way you've shaped the space here at school or at work or at home, there's some element of design that's gone into it. There's definitely some of us who've gotten a particular expert training in design, but everybody designs in their own way, and that's something that needs to be acknowledged. As far as expertise, you guys are all experts in your own life. There's no way that I could tell you how to live in your community or live in your particular class any more than you could. You could actually teach me something about doing that. And so I think it's really important to think about how do we acknowledge both of those things. The fact that there are some of us, like myself, who've probably been trained in a particular discipline, and so we're sort of what Jeremy Till calls an expert citizen, someone who does have that expertise, but we're also of a community. And then there's also the citizen expert, somebody who's an individual who's actually really well-versed in their community. And you can't really talk about doing projects that can create some sort of social change or do some sort of improvement in life without thinking about how do you bring both of those expertise to the table and celebrate mutual knowledge that each can learn from the other. It's not like the citizen expert can live without the expert citizen, nor vice versa. And so what I wanted to do before I actually got into some of the projects that I've worked on is talk a little bit about some of the principles that underpin my work. And this is definitely one of them. And it's this idea that we do need to come to the table, and we need to figure out what we can learn from one another. No matter how much education or training that other person at the table has, there's something of value that they're saying. I'm also really interested in this idea of who it is that we're designing for, this idea of client. So being trained as an architect and working in an architectural office, for us, client generally means the person who's paying the bills, the one who's hired us to do the project. But there's a whole host of people who get affected by whatever it is you ultimately create. And the idea is, how do you begin to think of them as also having value? This is Roberto, who's a day laborer, and it's never like he was ever going to walk into an architecture office and say, I could really use your help on the corner. Yet his needs and his desires were super important for me to understand how to design a project that involved him. And I think it works both ways. It's not only about me being able to hear their needs and desires to be able to design something effective, but also this idea that me as a designer, recognizing that there's value there, is meaningful to him. I found this quote to be particularly interesting, this idea that everybody wants to be validated, to know that their actions matter. And that's the basic human right, as is dignity. Someone once told me design equals dignity. And we tell Roberto a lot of things when we talk about the types of spaces that we design or don't design for him. We do the same for a lot of people around the world. And so really talking about how do you use design to instill a sense of dignity that everybody, I think we all would agree, has a right to. I'm also, as was mentioned in the introduction, a pretty avid traveler. I've been really fortunate to kind of travel all over the world, and I do it in large part because I'm really curious about people and about cultures, and really wanting to learn about how different people relate and interact with one another and form community. And for me, one of the things why that is interesting is I feel I learn more about here, which is home, by going outside and seeing how other people live, and whether there are things like innovations that can be brought forward, or if there are things that we're doing here that can be taken out. And it's really interesting when you travel and you can see all of the differences that people have, but also similarities. And that is really important as a designer, to be able to recognize those two things, because it can fuel a lot of our creativity. So for me, it's the information that I gain when I'm doing that travel, looking at it not as this catalog of stuff that I store up in my head, but actually how do I shape that, use that as a tool that I can actually shape the world through my designs. And then finally, I'm really interested in this issue of sustainability. So I think people, when we talk about sustainability, often think of saving the planet. There's been all of this conversation about climate change, given Sandy, and it is super important to think about sustainability in that terms. But I also think it's really important to think about sustainability more broadly. The true definition of sustainability, or rather the original definition, actually came about in the late 80s from the UN in a report that talked about meeting the needs of the present without sacrificing the ability of future generations to meet those needs. But we've just come through time to think about it only in terms of green or saving the planet. But to me, that then introduces the paradox that comes with this picture, which is of a library in Camden, New Jersey, or the remains of a library. And there's this lush, green, vibrant tree, which has been saved and is here, but you can sort of see that the community around it is not there. And so for me, it's something interesting when you talk about only nurturing natural life, but not nurturing the social life as well. And needing to talk about how those two things come together, to me, is what sustainability is about. And it's a really important consideration when we talk about design. So I wanted to go through a couple of projects that I've been involved with, and you'll see as I describe the projects a little bit about how some of those principles begin to find their way in terms of how I've approached the work or what designs have actually resulted. And then I'll end the lecture just talking a little bit about some of the stuff that I'm working on now and that I feel relates to where I think this field of social impact is headed. So one of the things that's super interesting to me about looking at the world in this way, particularly as a designer, is that I actually get a chance to impact a lot of different issues. It's not about creating a particular design object or design space, but it's really about how do I leverage design to begin to make an impact on some of the issues that affect the ways in which people live. So immigration is one that came up with a project called the Day Labor Station that I worked on as part of public architecture. And so day laborers, I think probably most of us in this room know who they are, people who look for a day's work for a day's wages. In San Francisco, we often see them congregating along Cesar Chavez. In Oakland, it's Fruitvale. There are over 100,000 day laborers in the United States, in cities across the country, large and small. And over 75% of the sites in which day laborers look for work at are informal sites. So gas stations, street corners, Home Depot parking lots. And at these sites, there's generally no access to water or to shelter or even to toilets. And so at public architecture, because the nature of how we worked was we thought of ourselves as problem identifiers, not just problem solvers, we were really interested as how we as architects could make an impact on this. And so we spent a lot of time working with the day laborers and actually looking at them as our true clients, the end users. Even though a city or a nonprofit might hire us, ultimately the project needed to be useful to them and to the day laborers themselves if it was ever going to be successful. And so we really wanted to understand how the day labor system operated. And when we talked to them, we found that a lot of there are some existing worker centers, but what you see is that a lot of them are buildings that were designed for other uses. So a construction office trailer or a church basement. And you'll see guys often standing in front of them, even in inclement weather. And a lot of that is because as you talk to the day laborers, you realize that visual engagement is really key to them for the employment transaction. Even if there's a lottery system in place, they want to see each and every hiring occur. And a lot of these buildings are designed such that that can't really happen. So that led to us designing in this way that we'd have something that was always kind of very simply open out to the employers driving up. We also found that day laborers were highly organized, and so we wanted to create something that was flexible enough that they could meet whenever they want. And finally, one of the things that we noticed is that day labor sites, the peak hiring time is often between 6 and 9 in the morning, but a lot of the guys hang out throughout the rest of the day, either hoping that somebody comes and hires them late, or because this is their community. And so what's been happening within the sort of immigration rights movement and people who serve the day labor populations is that they've been doing skills-based training, because over 50% of the people who come to hire day laborers are homeowners, and a lot of them come to the site saying, I want somebody who can speak English. And so by giving them English skills and other skills, you're actually enabling them to get hired more often or possibly even move out of day labor work. And so we wanted to design something that was completely adaptable to what we recognize as their needs and desires were by talking to them and actually visiting the site. And also because there are so many different sites and they are very much have different contexts and needs, we created this really as a kit of parts with an idea of a central seating area that had movable seats, a sheltered space up top, and then also these boxes could sort of change in use depending on what was needed. So it could be everything from a restroom to an office for a coordinator to even a kitchen. We looked at a lot of Home Depots where we saw taco trucks in the parking lot. And the customers of the taco trucks weren't the day laborers, but actually customers of Home Depot. And so we felt that this could actually really be a great income generator for the station, allowing them to use the money to maintain the station. And then going with this idea of being broadly sustainable, the idea was you're sort of solving for economic and social sustainability with the very nature of the station itself. And by these little elements of kind of environmental pieces, you could also make sure that it had a pretty light footprint. And so this idea was that the station could configure. So in this case, this was for a proposed site in Los Angeles where there were supposed to be over 150 workers served, and so we needed to make it a little bit bigger. And so this is consistent with the idea that you could completely manipulate it to fit what the needs were at any given site. So what was interesting is that, like, as architects, yes, this project kind of solved a basic need in terms of shelter and water. But then what we also found is that, particularly after 2006, 2007, when the last round of immigration legislation failed in the Senate, is that these sites started to become highly politicized. If you were angry about day laborers and you couldn't go to the border, or sorry, if you were angry about immigrants and you couldn't go to the border, you could go to your local day labor hiring site because you knew where that was. And so these became sites of conflict, even though for many times when people were arguing, you know, leave, go away, we don't want you here, many of these sites have been around for 20 or 30 years. If you go to any city, there's never a published list of where the day laborers are. You just ask somebody and they'll tell you, go to Cesar Chavez, that's where you hire them. And so to sort of say that, like, this is new and they disappear, it's temporary, is kind of a fallacy. The only thing that makes it feel temporary is that there's never been anything that has actually been built there to mark that these guys are there. And often, because there is nothing there, they're often seen as expendable. And so you often have drug dealers and other nefarious types hanging out amongst them because they know that the police don't bust them. And so I often get asked, well, you know, if you built something here, doesn't that all of a sudden make them more a target for immigration legislation? But if you talk to them, one of the things that they say is that this site is sacred and nobody recognizes that it's sacred. It's a place where they go to work, and they're sort of invisible because there's nothing there. And so they would rather have something, most of them, it's not universal, but many would rather have something there to be able to mark that they're there and to be able to use that as a pivot point to be able to negotiate with the city and the police and other groups instead of consistently being abused as they are now. And so one of the things that we took, even though we were architects, was looking at this idea of how do we communicate the story and how do we show that there's just as much value for building for them as any of the other people that we normally think of serving through architecture and design. And so one of the things was talking about the fact that day labor is something that's been around for centuries. And in this country, it was the dock workers back at the turn of the 20th century. And they were always a new immigrants, so Irish to Polish to Italians. And this was an entry point into the formal economy. And so keeping that in mind, one of the things that we felt we needed to do with this was look at it not just how it meets the basic needs of getting hired and having minimum things like shelter and water when you're at these sites, But then also, how does this become a point at which you could negotiate with the community and change the relationship of the workers with the community? And so in this site that was proposed for LA, it was such a huge site that we actually proposed doing a community garden that could be jointly tended to by the workers and the local community residents. So this project we'd been working on it for a number of years, and then it launched officially in 2007 when we were invited to be part of the design for the Other 90% exhibit at the Cooper Hewitt in New York. And we built a full-scale section for it and also did a lot of advocacy materials related to that. And in terms of an actual project success and what we normally consider for architecture, which is getting something built, this project was actually kind of a failure. We were never able to build it. We launched it right about the time that the economy tanked. And so trying to get a city, although we had cities coming to us and Catholic Charities and Home Depot, because everybody was kind of looking for a new solution. The idea of spending $100,000, $150,000 on immigrants when you're slashing school budgets and other services was kind of a non-tenable solution. But what was really interesting is this is a poster from an international award that we won. We were the only building to win it and the only US project to win it. It was the Wholesome Global Innovation Prize. And one of the things that we found was super interesting is that just by putting this project out there, people never really talked about day labor hiring sites before. Even our main partner, the National Day Labor Organizing Network, they'd been so busy on rights, they never really thought about the connection between the space and the workers. And so they started talking about it. They started using portraits like we were doing to sort of communicate this larger story. And on this poster, there are actually clips from emails that I've received over the years of doing this project, some super positive, like these guys work so hard and I'm so happy you're doing something for them, to build it and we will burn it down with those nasty Mexicans. And I think the point is that normally we think of architecture and design as being sort of apolitical, it's neutral, we're just doing it. But in doing that, we sort of forget that we have an ability to propel the conversation. And in this project, although we didn't get anything built, the idea that we were able to move this conversation, at least talk about these hiring sites, which had not really been talked about before, I think was a super important accomplishment. Another thing that I've been involved with is the concept of waste. The building industry is a particularly bad contributor to this. A quarter of what's in our nation's landfills actually come from buildings. We're also using about a third of the raw materials on the planet. And so thinking about what does that mean, and also what's the connection of waste, not just in terms of pure environmental things, but also in what we're throwing away. We're also throwing away a connection to history and memory. That became a really interesting project for us. And it was actually a series of projects at Public Architecture. It started first with Scrap House, which was a demonstration house built here in San Francisco for World Environment Day back in 2005. And it was a house made completely out of junk. 100% of the materials, except for the nails and screws for obvious reasons, were made from materials gotten from other building sites, from the landfills, from whatever scrap house we could find. So everything from, these are painted shower doors to scrap metal. There are fire hose walls over in there, chandelier made from old lamps. And the idea was, how could you create something beautiful out of junk? Because I think a lot of times when people think of using salvage in buildings, they often think of something very kitschy. And we really felt it was important to convey this message of something even greater. And so how do you suggest that actually salvage and waste could be turned into something beautiful? That was hugely important to actually getting people to buy into this idea of doing more. And so you can see these are some more of the materials. We even had a phone book wall, a solid core door floors. And this was designed and built within 6 weeks, which was a bit crazy. The whole thing was turned into a National Geographic Channel documentary. And it was only open for 4 days. But in the 4 days, over 10,000 people came to see it. And I think one of the things about it was that people just found it so exciting, this ability to come and see these materials in a new way, and that you could touch and that you can engage it. And it was a very experiential thing, and it was like always a surprise. So whether you were coming up against the phone book wall or there were keyboards over there, it was super exciting, and it got people to think about these materials that they normally would throw away. And so based on the success of that, we were actually invited to go up to Seattle and work with a group called TAF, which is a Technology Access Foundation. And they had worked into a partnership with the city to build a new headquarters and community center in a sort of underserved area just south of Seattle. And they were really interested in this idea of doing salvage. TAF does math, science, and technology tutoring to underprivileged kids in the Seattle area. And for them, they were really interested in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And then we're interested in this idea of the building as a teaching tool for the environmental components, but then also potentially, given that they were doing it with a marginalized community, how could it also address some of the other elements that they connected with social and economic sustainability? So with salvage, we wanted to take this to another level. Instead of just thinking of like, oh, we're going to slap it on some walls, we wanted to really integrate it throughout the building. So the entire building was an experience of learning about these materials and learning about how to be more sustainable. And so everything from a bridge that would lead up, that would be made out of salvaged timbers, to a wall made out of solid core doors, and even fire hose partition walls. And so this is an example of the bridge, and the idea is that the materials were sourced from within the community, so it was really about picking things that were seen as having memory. So these timbers that you see are actually from a public housing project that was being torn down. And you can sort of imagine public housing having one particular memory that's maybe not necessarily positive, but trying to recast it in new light, something beautiful. You're not necessarily throwing away that memory, you're acknowledging that this existed in the community, but you're trying to paint it in a new way that people could celebrate it as now part of a new future. So the building actually, after many years of fundraising, because they were trying to fundraise within a recession, just opened up actually last week. So here's a view actually coming in, and some of the materials have changed. So originally we were thinking of salvage metal on this part over here, and actually it's just a sort of wood material called Parklex, which is used in a lot of buildings that they got off of several different building projects in the Seattle area. And here's a close-up of the Parklex wall, and then we still ended up using solid core doors that came from a mix of housing projects and office buildings that were being renovated within the Seattle area. And the idea is that as the child goes through this space, they can sort of experience the building, experience the materials, and experience the idea of sustainability in new ways. So that project was really interesting experience. I was sort of the primary person on the ground sourcing the materials, and it was kind of a bitch, for lack of a better word. Doing salvage, particularly in areas like the Bay Area or up in Seattle or even Portland, works really well when you're doing your house and you just need like a salvage door or some salvage timber for your floor. If you're trying to do a 20,000 square foot building, it is almost impossible. The system is not set up for it, particularly given the building process where we need to know the materials at this point, and then we may not even build for a year, or in this case for 3 or 4 years when the fundraising is finally there. And so the idea of where do you store those materials, or how do you make sure they're there in time, and contractors are very wary of dealing with things that they don't understand, actually became super complicated. And at public architecture, one of the things that was super important to us is this idea of not only just being the ones who are out there doing these kind of funky, progressive, socially relevant projects, but also enabling everybody else to do it. We can't really scale social change if it's just about these isolated nonprofits and design studios that take it on. We need to really create a way that everybody can get into it. And so for us, that way in this case, because we really believed in the power of this and we really saw the excitement that everybody had when they saw Scrap House or heard about the Taft project, was that we needed to create ways so that everybody else could do it. You just didn't have to be a nonprofit with a hardcore social mission. And so we applied for funds from the U.S. Green Building Council to do a 2-year research grant where we would actually produce a primer, because I was literally on Google looking for can I find a project that's done salvage materials, and then track somebody down and ask them how they did it with codes and all of that stuff. And so this was a way that we wanted to really share and spread the knowledge, not only from the project we were doing, but from the projects that others were engaged in. So we produced this primer. It was available online for free. You can still get it. We've actually expanded it to it's now a whole library. But we wanted to take 15 projects all over the country, dealing with all different project types, commercial scale for the most part, and really tell the story of reuse, both how they did it in process, but also connected to that larger story of what did it mean for the social, economic, and environmental sustainability. And as you can see, it's pretty diverse in terms of how, types. And what we also wanted to do is, I think oftentimes people were like, oh, you're in California, so of course you can build something green or do with salvage. And so we wanted to make sure to pull from everywhere. So whether it was the Deep South or the Northeast or the Midwest or even Canada. And so within the guide, we really walked people through the process, because a lot of times what we found is if you saw a magazine article that talked about salvage, it would often tell the story of it, just like that it used materials, but it wouldn't tell you where it came from, how they actually did all of it, how they paid for it, how they stored it. These are all the things you need for it to actually be replicable. So we wanted to make sure to really get into the nitty-gritty of that process, and then also talk about the lessons learned and give people an opportunity to learn more. And so for me, one of the really important things that came up with this project in terms of projects showed was that we really chose only beautiful projects. If you were ugly, you could not get into this book. Because we didn't want it to seem like, I think one of the things with sustainability and why it took so long to get as much traction, particularly environmental sustainability, is because when people looked at buildings that were quote unquote green, they weren't very pretty. And we all have connections to things that are beautiful and really want to be in things that are beautiful. And so for us, being able to tell the idea of salvage and getting more people to adopt it was really, we needed to show beautiful things, because that was what would people would emotionally connect to. And we also needed to tell great stories, because in a lot of times, doing something, salvage is definitely not the easiest route you can take to doing something sustainable, but it's a very meaningful route. But for things that are complicated and not necessarily a step-by-step approach, sometimes the only people you can get are the early adopters. And in order to get people who are more mainstream, we needed to talk about how these buildings are to have deeper meaning for the clients, and you have people be able to use that as a way to convince others to sort of get on the train. So in this case, it was a school that's actually down the coast, and it's a really amazing story. It's for learning disabled children. And for them, they were really excited about this idea of the teaching tool of salvage materials, because they basically felt that a lot of these kids don't learn in traditional ways, but visual learning is super important for them. So if the building itself became basically the third teacher, that would allow the knowledge to actually stick with the students a lot more. And so, being able to have the head of the school talk about this power of materials was super important. He was one of the biggest champions on this project. This is a great project down in New Orleans that was basically a place that had been kind of in the community for many years, like over 100 years, and it had been ravaged by Katrina, and there was nothing left. And they wanted to rebuild it as a community center because it had always been kind of a gathering point within the community. And one of the things that was really important is that if you have such a storm as huge as Katrina that wipes everything away, when you're rebuilding, it's often easy to rebuild new, but there was so much memory embedded that got lost by all these buildings being destroyed. They wanted to find a way to retain some of that. And they also wanted to extend a little bit further in talking about materials connected to meaning. And so some of the materials that they ended up getting actually came from further away, because they kind of just really got into the salvage material business. And including, they got some materials that were actually part of the stage that Obama got inaugurated on back in 2008. And for them, that was something that they could point to, and that would also symbolize rebirth for this community. And then this was a great project out of Chicago that was with a Jewish congregation that was looking to rebuild their old synagogue. And one of the things that they were also moving towards is this idea of how do we live as a sustainable community, not just environmentally sustainable, but socially and economic. And so they decided to take this idea of the building project and have the building be a symbol of how they, as a community, had decided to now try and live and practice. And so many of the things that they say about the building, I wanted to quote the rabbi because it was just so amazing, and talking about what these materials could do and how it could bring the community together. So that is available online. You just go to Public Architecture's website and you can download it and look through all those projects. So water is another thing that I've sort of been actively involved with. This is a project that I did at IDEO.org called Smart Life. And it was clients were a combination of Unilever and two NGOs, Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor and the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. And they had this crazy idea that they wanted to create a business that would do both selling of clean water and selling of hygiene and nutrition products, because they believed that everybody had traditionally in this market been operating separately, but they actually believed that those things were all interrelated, and if they created a business that dealt with all three of those things, they could actually make more impact for low-income Kenyans. So, I mean, and there was huge amount of statistics related to this globally in terms of the impacts of each of those things, whether it's being able to get access to clean water, or the impacts of not having good hygiene, or even the nutritional impacts. And then in Kenya, it was also particularly severe. Only about 60% of the population actually had access to clean water. Diarrhea was one of the top 10 causes of morbidity and mortality, and over 84% of preschool-age children had vitamin A deficiency, and there were tons of other deficiencies that also existed. So the idea of addressing all of these were super important. Anything you could do to actually maximize the impact was also something that people really responded to. So they had the great idea, but they had no idea how to do it, and so they approached us at IDEO.org to take it on. So we spent 2 weeks in Nairobi, and part of IDEO's process and IDEO.org's process is this idea of human-centered design. So very akin to what I was mentioning earlier, putting the user at the forefront. And so in order to understand what this business needed to look like, we had to actually talk to people who might potentially be consumers or relate with it in any way, whether they were other entrepreneurs selling water or selling hygiene and nutrition products, or even the government agency who ran sort of water issues for the country. And then additionally, to interviewing people, we also had to figure out what this business would be. And we could easily have gone and done all the research and then come back here to the US and sort of worked in our nice little office and tried to figure out what that business was going to be. But we realized that we actually needed to test the business there in the field. So in the 2 weeks, we ended up doing a lot of prototyping and had 3 prototyping days where we actually were running the business, and we had created a fake brand and a fake logo, and we're basically trying to be as legit as possible. So, oops. So here's just some snapshots from that time in the field, whether it was setting up the actual business. Our clients came into the field with us, which was kind of a crazy, wild ride. But we were able to do a lot of synthesis with them at that time. And then, here's sort of an example of a traditional water seller, and everybody was kind of really amazed and in awe and wanted to talk to us with our white jerry cans and logos and understand what it is. So we were actually able to have really interesting conversations as a result of putting this prototype in live action. One of the things that we found when we did the actual prototype is that our clients had kind of come in with this idea of like, all 3 of these things are important. We need to address them mutually. And one of the things that we found when we were running the business is that, yeah, the hygiene and nutrition stuff, it's important, but really the pain point for people was clean water. Like, they were really having a hard time getting clean water. And if we tried to do all 3, it would be fine, but like if you said we have a business selling clean water, that would be a way to actually get into people's homes and their lives to sell some of the other stuff and do the health education connected to it. So we sort of said, to kind of compellingly convince our clients that we needed to basically do a little bit of a Trojan horse, that the front face of this business needed to be selling clean water and that the other stuff could follow. And this was one of the things that was really great about doing the actual prototyping, is that from the interviews, we'd sort of gotten that, but we really couldn't tell. But then when we actually tried to run the business, we got, people thumbed through the products that we got. We had some Target products, we had some stuff we got over there, and they found them really interesting. They did buy certain things, which gave us clues about the products to offer, but the things that everybody wanted was the water. That was like by far the biggest seller, no matter how much we charged for it. And so that gave us a huge amount of insight as to what would actually drive this business. So based on being out there and actually doing those prototyping and the interviews, we were able to kind of create a business that would talk about how we would introduce ourselves to people, how we would do the exchange, where it would happen, how delivery would happen. And all of this was product of a design process. So I think a lot of times we think of designers as just doing objects or spaces, and one of the things that was really important to this project was really taking the design process and applying it to the entire system. How do you design a system using all the elements that we normally apply to more tangible things? Oops. And so for me as an architect, it was really funny doing this fellowship at IDEO.org because I barely touched a building the entire year. This was the first time I actually got to do a building drawing. But what was really interesting is to sort of understand that it wasn't just about the space. Like, this was super important, but it was understanding how the space fit within that entire system. And again, being able to move from the small of these little components that we were designing to the big of the whole system in terms of how it worked together was super important. So we designed the entire business model from figuring out what this thing needed to actually be financially sustainable, because the idea was that it was going to be a social enterprise. So while Unilever and the 2 NGOs were pouring money on the front end, this thing in about 5 to 7 years needed to be able to exist on its own and be run completely by Kenyans. We also had to figure out what people actually wanted. We could say that our clients wanted to, Unilever has its suite of products, and so definitely those products had to be in there, but we had to put products that people actually wanted. And so that was also part of the design process that came with the interviews and the prototyping, is actually figuring out what people wanted, where we would touch them that would be maximum impact. So originally we thought we were making a decision between doing door-to-door or doing a kiosk or having a mobile cart seller. And what we found is that actually all of those together, and this is what came through the prototyping, was super effective. Counterfeit was a huge issue in Kenya. And so if you just did door-to-door and there was no place that somebody knew that they could go and complain, nobody was going to buy into this business. And so we realized we had to do all of these pieces together in order to make it work. And then how the thing was making money, and then also who our target customers would be. And so we ended up handling this massive deck to our client that consisted of everything from more traditional elements like, what is all the collateral going to look like, to actually telling them what the customer experience was going to be, walking them through from the moment that somebody finds out about the business to when they get water, and to when even they exit the system, what is that going to be? And all of that was deliberately designed. And then finally, what we handed off to our client, and this was one of the exciting things about having them in the field, is that often I think as a designer and sometimes as a consultant, or more so as a consultant, you're used to doing things and then handing it off to your client, and then you kind of go off and do something else. The problem is if we just hand off a deck and we haven't actually trained our clients, in many cases, how can we ensure that there's actually viability and success in what they're doing, especially if they're not familiar with the design process? And so having our clients in the field was super important to kind of training them in a way, but then also with giving them this launch plan. In successive pages, we actually talk them through when they go through evaluation points, which we indicated, and this is for the pilot. We indicated the types of questions that they should be asking and the things they should be looking at. And so now they feel more confident about being the ones to launch it and to actually run it and to test it. The final project I wanted to talk about is one that has to do with health and the issue of cook stoves. So there's a huge issue in the developing world cooking over open fires. It's a huge smoke inhalation issue for women, particularly because a lot of them are doing it inside. There's also a huge environmental issue with all the smoke in the atmosphere and then also the wood that gets cut down. So there's a huge push from the UN and other governments to try and address it and provide cook stove technology so that there is a sort of cleaner cooking. So we were hired by the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves at IDEO.org to basically try and figure out how we could increase adoption. The technology of cook stoves, this is not necessarily a super advanced cook stove, but in general, the technology of cook stoves has actually been really improving over the last 20 years, but adoption rates had not been improving. And they wanted to figure out how do we get more people to buy cook stoves and to use cook stoves. So they sent us to Tanzania, which was one of the focus countries where they didn't have a lot of research. And one of the things that we found in talking to them is that a lot of the work that had been done over the last 30 years at looking at adoption issues had been either focused on how do we improve the technology of the stove itself, or market research, how do we actually get this more into the country. Nobody had actually taken a lot of time to talk to the cooks themselves. So we spent the bulk of our research actually doing that. As you can see, we talked to 68 people, including 45 users, women all over the country. We traveled to 3 different cities and set up shop there. And we even also cooked with them because we wanted to understand what it was like. And so there were many meals. Tanzanian food is not that good, so it was sort of interesting. And some, somewhat questionable chicken plucking and stuff. But basically what was really nice about the cooking was not only were we getting to see what it was like to work on the cook stove, but you can imagine if you're going in, even if you're doing an in-depth interview over an hour, it's still hard for people to relax. You're the foreigner who's come into their place and you're asking them all of these questions. But by actually cooking with them, we were there for hours. And the fact like we were the crazy Mzungus who were plucking chickens and doing the mbuzi with the coconut. They started to laugh at first and then warm up to us, and we started to have really interesting and amazing conversations and insights about what were the challenges of the cooking technology. We also did a bit of prototyping in this project, and so we met with some local cook stove makers, and because we had some ideas as we were talking to people of, I wonder if we do this thing, whether people will actually respond to it. So we literally went, partly to also understand what it goes into making a cook stove in the local market, but then partly to be able to design these things that we could then take with us to all the interviews that we had subsequently. And so this idea of prototyping, removing it, I mean, as an architect, when we talk about prototyping, it's usually something that comes at the end of the design process, like the thing is largely baked and you just want to check out a couple of things. And here was really using the prototype as part of the act of designing. So what was really great was being able to talk to these women and really understanding what cooking was in part of their day. And it was a huge part of the day. When you finished breakfast, it was almost time to go do lunch and dinner. And what we found is like us when we're cooking here, they have particular needs. And so in the cook stove world, they often talk about how do we get people to adopt a stove? But the reality is that people use a lot of different technologies to cook, just like we do here. You have your microwave, your stove, your toaster oven, your crock pot. And you use them depending on what you're cooking and how fast you need to cook it. And it's no different for them. If they have a lot of people coming over, there's a particular technology they're going to do. If they're going to cook chai in the morning, you don't want to waste all of those charcoals heating up when you could just do it on a kerosene stove. And so going in and actually helping our client kind of demystify that this is not about adoption of a stove. Many people totally get the benefits of a cook stove. It's more about the fact that the cook stove doesn't serve their needs 100% of the time. And so we actually laid out for our client that these are all the different technologies that we saw present within this landscape, and that this was actually the way in which use was happening. And that in order to talk about how do you get at adoption, you needed to understand that this was actually what was happening on the ground, which hadn't really been a part of a lot of the research up until that point. And so what we ended up proposing to them was 5 shifts, the largest one being this idea of moving away from talking about acquiring a stove, because people get that, to actually using the stove more often, and that there was a series of things that you could do with that. So one of the things we talked about is that a lot of times in the cook stove industry, they talk about it in terms of how do we have cleaner burning stoves and more efficient burning stoves? How do we help it save fuel? But the fuel savings are so minuscule that people don't really notice that. And the fact of the matter, it is still as ridiculously hard to cook on a cook stove as it is over an open fire. And when people spend money in the kitchen, they spend it on things that actually make the act of cooking easier. So a blender or a refrigerator that you can store things. They're not going to spend it on a fancy cook stove that maybe saves them a little bit more fuel. But you could get a lot of people to use a cook stove more often if it actually made cooking easier to use. And so to sort of reinforce that insight, we would tell the stories of kind of individuals that we met along the way and how their cooking technologies operated when they went from one technology to another. And then we actually gave, like, here's an opportunity area where you can actually make an impact. And so in this case, it was like, if you create things that make cooking easier, you'll actually get people to use a cook stove more often. And when we just presented some initial insights to allow them to see potential of where things could go. So, and that's one of the insights was this idea of you could start designing accessories that would go along with the stove that would actually make the act of cooking easier. So I was just going to really quickly show a video that we had done, because I think part of what we noticed is that it's also super important to not only sell these in terms of to our clients and to the world at large in terms of what what you can do in terms of designing new objects, but also how do you really communicate what we saw in the field. So we had the benefit of being able to be there for several weeks on end and talking to all of these women. How do we bring their stories back to the client so they can really understand it? Seems to go. So one of the things about both IDEO and public architecture is this idea of making all of the work completely public and being able to allow others to learn from it. And so for us, in addition to telling that story for our client, it was also about putting it out there and putting the whole entire deck that we delivered to our client. And so what was really interesting is we got tons of emails back from people who had read it and were either doing cook stoves anywhere in the world and kind of found that framework to be super useful and to help them be able to tell the story to the people that they were dealing with. But then also just that idea of getting those insights in general about that particular place was also really significant for them. And for a client, what this ended up doing, even though it took them a while to realize that's what it ended up doing, is that they started repositioning the way in which they were talking about cook stoves to their partners and amongst one another in terms of the cook and how do they put that actually at the center of what they were doing. So I just quickly wanted to go over a couple of things that I'm working on now that I think actually kind of connect to how this stuff is moving forward. So one of the projects I'm doing is with the Nike Foundation, along with a co-fellow of mine from IDEO.org, Marika Shiori-Clark, on safe spaces in Nigeria. So Nike Foundation, since the Girl Effect video of a couple of years ago, which if you haven't seen it, it's a really amazing video, so I highly suggest Googling it, which talks about how outcomes for women is actually really determined by the time a girl is 12 in a lot of countries around the world, and how we need to channel programs and efforts to really help support strong women, whether it comes through delaying early marriage or helping them with birth or education or any of those things. And so one of the things that's been bubbling up within development circles is this idea of how do you create a safe space for a girl, whether it's a physical space or a virtual space. And everyone from DFID, which is sort of the UK's version of USAID, to Population Council have been actively looking in, we've got the programs, now we need to figure out what a safe space is. So people have been talking about safe spaces, but nobody's actually been determining what it is. So now this project with Nike Foundation is using Nigeria as sort of a test, is figuring out what that is through the design process and actually doing a lot of co-design and co-creation with girls in northern Nigeria. And this idea of trying to come up with, is it a physical space? And if it's a physical space, what are the properties of it? Or if it's a virtual space, what does that look like? And how can it be a framework for all of these other programs that are related to these ideas of increasing education and economic freedom, delaying early marriage and birth, et cetera. So for me, it's really exciting because there's a lot of this movement in the developing world where they don't quite understand what design can do other than the pure project, but there's starting to be an interest of how you could use the design process to create frameworks to actually get at some of the end goals that they're interested in. Another project that I'm sort of working on the side is this idea of tactical urbanism. So tactical urbanism is sort of a catch-all phrase for a lot of stuff that's happening in cities all over the world where there's very limited resources and people are basically taking initiative, whether it's from an architectural professional expert perspective or citizens, to actually reclaim various pieces of space and turn it into productive uses. And it can be everything from as benign to urban agriculture, so guerrilla farming, to the parklets that we see here in San Francisco and Parking Day, to Proxy, to this project which is in Detroit, which is the Alley Project, which took a very underutilized and even abandoned lot and garage and turned it into a public open space that actually incorporated the work of some of the graffiti artists in the neighborhood, trying to turn it from a sort of negative associated art to something where they could display it as kind of a public art that could be celebrated. And so this project I'm working on is how do we begin to catalog some of these things and actually understand the positive impacts of it and almost what's the recipes that create successful tactical urbanism projects. So that right now, that research is occurring here in San Francisco and in Detroit. And then for me, one really super interesting thing that I'm starting to see happening is that, in social impact, we kind of had the social impact designers, and then we had the rest of the social impact world, so the development community. And we often existed in kind of separately. The social impact designers would kind of do their own thing, would understand that there's, you need to consider economics and sociology and all of that stuff, but we had our own conferences, our own convenings, we knew all the people within that world. Same thing over on this side. And what's beginning to happen is that we're now starting to talk about ways, not just on singular projects, like some of the ones I've shown of how we come together, but actually at larger conversational convenings. So last month I was in Brazil, which is not a bad place to have to go to a conference, for the Social Entrepreneurship World Forum, which is sort of the largest convening around social entrepreneurship in the world. And it rotates around every year. This is the 5th year that they've had it, and this is the first year that they did a design track. They didn't quite understand how design could impact what they were doing, but they had some sense that designers needed to be at the table. And so we had a panel that talked about how design could improve social entrepreneurship and the creative economy. And then we actually ran a 2-day design lab that was talking about what is using the design thinking process to figure out what is the future of social entrepreneurship in Brazil. And what was super interesting is we had to figure out ways to engage both the Portuguese speakers and the English speakers, and also there was Spanish and German and all over, to contribute to this and to be able to distill that knowledge, because we had an amazing group of people who were really well versed in social entrepreneurship, but came from different sectors, whether it was the impact investing, whether it was a person who was actually doing the business, whether it was the NGO who was holding an incubator. And while they were sort of conversing by being at this conference, they were all kind of speaking different languages. And so bringing it down to the basic level of what does social entrepreneurship mean to you, and how can we find common ground, and kind of taking that through a design thinking process was really interesting. And so it wasn't like at the end of the 2 days we solved the future of social entrepreneurship in Brazil, because that's like a huge project, but we helped help them think about what is a framework to get at that answer a few years down the road, but still, how do you use design to be able to get there? Another thing that was super interesting that happened 2 months ago was the Clinton Global Initiative had as its theme designing for impact. Again, first time design had ever been brought up in that circle. And in addition to weaving design throughout the entire thing and having folks like Tim Brown do the kickoff plenary, they also had design thinking workshops on various issues, from energy to early childhood education to women in the economy to healthy cities. And what was fascinating is that you had people like the Surgeon General, the president of Pepsi, and I can't remember, he's like a huge official in Nigeria, sitting at a table, doing brainstorming, cutting up things, gluing it together, and using the design process to try and figure out how to get at some of these really messy problems. Again, there was a lot of unfamiliarity about how design could make an impact, but people had a sense that it could and were really interested to try. And so these conversations are still at this early stage, but they're starting to happen more and more and at bigger and bigger convenings. And so I'm really excited to see where that evolves in the coming years. And then just finally, so my project of why I'm here at CCA this year, although I've been kind of teaching at CCA off and on for the last couple of years, I'm actually posted as a scholar in residence at the Center for Art and Public Life. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the center, it's kind of been around for many, many years, and it's sort of the main community engagement engine here at the school. And so the work that I'm doing with them is trying to figure out how do they take the amazing stuff that they're doing and begin to amplify impact. How do we begin to talk more about not just art, but design? How do we talk about social innovation connected to some of the stuff that I've shown here today? And then also, how do you begin to spread that impact throughout the broader world? And so that's a really interesting project, and I'm kind of like the quasi in-house consultant bringing that outside voice, but I think you'll see things coming from that over the course of the year. So finally, just quickly, I always show this project at the end of lectures, because for me, it's kind of a great call to action of how anyone can really make a difference, and particularly the designers in the room kind of pushing you to use your skills. This is a project that was done by Marmol Ratzinger down in LA. They're a design and build firm, and this is a park that was located near their office. And the park was always fenced off. The only time you ever saw anyone there was when the city maintenance guy came to mow the lawn once a month. And so they got really pissed off, because they were like, this is a park, and we actually want to use it. And so they built a ladder, and they erected it in the middle of the night. And it was up for about 6 weeks before it got torn down, and the community was kind of in a huge uproar, because they were like, well, there were drug dealers, there were homeless people, it wasn't safe, we had to close off the park. But it sort of sparked this conversation about what does it mean to have a park that's neither public nor open. And so, again, like the Day Labor Station project, this idea of how do you use design to initiate something. They didn't create a building, but they sparked a conversation where people kind of just accepted the status quo. And we never heard what ended up happening with the project, but I think that idea of suggesting the kind of possibilities, like, all right, this park is closed, we're not going to accept it as that. Let's speak to the possibility of what if we open that park? What if we provided that access? I think is super important. And so this is a tool that I think everyone has, whether you're a designer who can go and build that ladder, or you're a citizen expert who just has immense knowledge about your community and is able to identify problems to be able to make a change. And so I think figuring out ways to bring that together and put that out there in the world is super important. And so I sort of challenge all of you here to think about ways that you can do that. So thank you for listening to me blabber. Are there any questions? About what?
Architecture for the salvage buildings. Were they certified, LEED certified at the end?
The TAF or any of the ones that we covered in the...
Right.
Not all of them were. Some of them were. And I mean, so here's the challenge with LEED. It's great in that it's brought so many people onto kind of the sustainability wagon, but it's also kind of a little bit paint by numbers now. And so I think when people are like beholden to that's the only way to be sustainable, it becomes a problem. So with a lot of these projects, what we did as sort of a checklist is that even if they didn't get LEED, we tried to make sure that they had, sustainability was part of the conversation from very early on. But I mean, it's kind of, I was on a jury a couple of years ago, and we were kind of laughing because it was like the big AIA jury awards, and like every other project was like a LEED Platinum. It's like, oh, here's another LEED Platinum building. And on the one hand, it's amazing because 5 years ago, there was like one LEED Platinum building that would have been guaranteed the award just by being LEED Platinum. But now so many projects had sort of achieved that, and you know, if you spend enough money, you can totally do that, that we have to find other ways to do measures of sustainability. So LEED's a great sort of barometer in terms of the sense like, great if you do it and everybody should have minimum certain amount of LEED certification, but then it's also like kind of a lot of money. So if you're, yeah, I mean, in LEED right now for salvage materials, I mean, there's credits, but it's super hard to get. Even that project in Seattle that I showed, it was really hard for us to get it because of the way LEED does the calculations. Since we did this research project, they've started to modify the LEED rating system so that that is easier. But I think it's like you have to be committed to doing a sustainable building, not a LEED building. Any other questions?
I have a question about the bottom line costs, like reclaimed materials. I'm just wondering where the scales are. Our resources are becoming more and more scarce, so it's also very labor intensive to deconstruct and like salvage and organize and know what you're working with.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, where do you see that right now? Because is the scale starting to tip where it actually will become more feasible and not such a more meaning-making value proposition, but actually a monetary one that will affect bottom line?
Yeah, I mean, I think so right now if you take like salvage wood, that there are times where it's gone so far off the rails that it's super expensive and really hard to integrate. But if you're sourcing, what we found is when you're sourcing from within the community, that reduces the cost. And like, so like things like Living Building Challenge, which reward you for having like a closer proximity, that people have been able to get a better bang for the buck off of that. And then, I mean, there's still, just to get the economies of scale, it's still hard. Like a lot of the reuse stores only do at a residential scale. They don't carry commercial scale quantity of materials. So I think reuse is still at a price premium, and it's going to be that way for a while. But it's also evaluating your costs in terms of, are you looking at front-end costs of what you're paying to get the materials in there? Or are you looking at the overall cost of, what we found from a lot of people is being able to point to this was great for like fundraising, like both the synagogue project, and then we also have a project in there, that, well, actually we have like 4 or 5 projects where they say explicitly they would never have been able to raise the money that they did in support of the project without having done salvage materials, that connection actually helped with the fundraising goals. And then also you have from a business standpoint, I mean, part of why you see so many projects being LEED Platinum now is not necessarily because there's like a built-in requirement for it, but more so that they can see the kind of PR return on that and also the life cycle return on that. And so we're seeing, salvage materials doesn't necessarily make it cheaper to run the energy in your building, but it might attract somebody to the building who's interested in supporting that mission. So we're seeing the costs payoff come in those. Right, so like the upfront is still like ridiculously hard, although if you deploy some of these strategies that we found, you can significantly reduce the cost, but it's really about the payback that happens once it's built or as you're building because of other things that people can tie into.
So by example, that's becoming more and more apparent to potential projects.
Just
so
like people.
They just have to, it has to happen more and more. For people that aren't aware of how it's affecting the environment to see the long term.
Right, exactly. And telling these stories, right? Like what we found is that it was impossible to find these stories. And so that was part of the mission of the project, is to be able to tell it so that other people could see it, and that you could go into your client or you could go into your contractor and be able to point to this and say, look, these guys were able to do it. They made it work within the building process. They got the building done for cheaper than they would have thought of, or any of these things to really like sell the case for it.
Going on that topic of doing salvage at the commercial scale, did you have any thoughts about conventions when it comes to building processes or platforms that would just make it easier to make these matches between excess materials and places to use them? Because I worked on a project once in New York where we studied taking concrete panels off a building and trying to reuse them, but by the time you haul it out of the city, store it, and then bring it back, it's way too expensive to try to do that.
Yeah, so we didn't necessarily look at that because that was slightly outside of our brief, but like particularly in the period that I was working on this project, there was a lot of like reuse conferences and conversations. We did try and do something here in the Bay Area where we were like, let's just, because I was talking to everybody anyway for this project, so I was like, can we just convene a roundtable and have the city official talk to these contractors and to these architects and try and figure out if there's something that could be created. And it's just, I think it's a very localized thing a lot of times to figure out how to do it, and some of it gets covered through some city ordinances, like Portola Valley, which has one of the projects in there, set up an ordinance that actually requires when you are taking down a building to kind of figure out where the materials are going to, and actually creates a sort of bonus thing to require actually figuring out if the materials don't go to landfill, where else do they go to? But it's what I was seeing is sort of little things like that. But there are some national websites, but they still don't have enough volume yet to be functional. But where I've seen huge growth is actually with brokers. So individual brokers who are working on a either regional or national basis, and they're kind of doing all of the work of connecting, they're finding the materials for you. You hire them almost like you would any other consultant on the project. And that seems to be getting traction and success. And so a lot of the big projects I've heard of lately that have used reclaimed materials have been going that route. There's a great company called Planet Reuse that's kind of one of the leaders in that. Go here first.
I have a question about the video.
Sure.
As I understand it, you made the video to sort of sell an idea to your client. Is that right?
Yeah, it was partly that, and to anyone else who was going to clue into the project. The Global Alliance is kind of like a UN entity. It's just a small little program within the UN. But then what it is almost like a membership association where they have cook stove manufacturers, NGOs providing all over the world. And so we felt is like, yes, our deck would sort of do one thing, but people might say, oh, you guys are just, designers and put it together. But like actually seeing the women there and seeing that live, we felt could add an additional layer of truth, if you will, to convince them that like this is why the things we put in there are so important. Yeah, let's go there and there.
Especially involve public directly. So sometimes you have to probably, I don't know, are there any meetings that public comes and discusses some issues? Because I think it is probably difficult, right?
Yeah.
To find that point where everybody agrees and everybody's satisfied, especially when it comes to public. So how do you?
Yeah, I mean, I think here's a challenge that we've been facing in the social impact world of like wanting to have an inclusive process, but then also, you know, the death by community meeting thing. And then which, if you're laughing, you totally know what I'm talking about. And I think one of the things that I've found super interesting about IDEO.org and IDEO's process is kind of starting more at the level of the individual first, and kind of getting the champions and the voices from that, and then working up to more small groups and even large groups. And I think you kind of need to approach it at both ends of the scale. I think that like when you only use a large community process to figure out, you're not necessarily going to get all the voices, because usually the people who have the most to complain about speak the loudest. And what you need to hear from is both those people and the one who will never say a word. And so sometimes framing or designing a community meeting process that allows kind of small groups to happen, or allows you to at least be able to tap into that individual voice, or where you're balancing individual meetings in people's homes or at their workplaces with these larger things, I think is super important. If you check out the Detroit Design Center from the University of Detroit Mercy, they've had this really tremendous process over the last year and a half, 2 years, where they were doing part of the Detroit Works project, which is this massive revisioning of master plan of what's happening in Detroit. They touched over 100,000 people in that time, which is amazing. But they got like really great bits of information, and part of it was deploying strategies that existed, everything from the large community meeting to they designed a little community feedback table where they would post somebody and actually have like real dialogue. And they're coming out with, in I think the next 6 months, a catalog of all the different engagement processes that they use. So it's not out yet, but it's something to watch. But I think you need to do a mix in order to get at, and I think you need to be willing to be nimble. So that thing in Brazil was like a complete failure when we did it as like big brainstorming process, but when we started contacting people on an individual basis, and I like would see somebody kind of standing and I'd be like, hi, come on in, I want to ask you about what is the future of social entrepreneurship. I got more content that way. So it was mixing the ones where we were talking to larger groups with smaller that allowed us to get answers.
Stations for immigration workers.
Oh, the station for that one. Yeah, so that process, we got to smaller community meetings, but most of what we tried to do was keep it very small, because we knew, particularly since immigration was such a flashpoint, that it was just never going to work. And what we tried to do is make sure that we were getting the feedback from the workers, but then have a smaller meeting with community members, a smaller meeting with the NGOs. So like we kind of kept the groups separate for a while, and then we brought representatives from the groups together to have the more nitty-gritty. And then because we never got to the point in any community where the city was ready to like unveil it we never tested it sort of then to that next step. But what we did is we isolated who the constituencies were and kind of took what they wanted and what they needed, and then kind of also brought representatives. So sort of moving back and forth between various ways of doing it. Shirley, Jeff.
Great talk, Liz.
Thanks.
That's really nice. I was really fascinated by the project about young women, the teenagers, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the relationship between their social, psychological, intellectual needs and what we as design, how did that play out in the design world, like in terms of space or objects?
So I mean, literally, I've been in the synthesis session for this for the last 3 days. So Marika is kind of the on-the-ground person, and then I'm here in the synthesis. And so what happened is she ran co-design workshops with the girls, trying to figure out and interviews, and so trying to understand their day, understanding what opportunities they had to relate to one another, to get out of their house, what were their aspirations, and from that, and then also interviewed parents as well to get that content. And so what we found is that the days were highly structured, and that while a child may have aspirations for education, there was a thing that if she was not seen as being smart, or if the family ran on tight times, that her school fees wouldn't necessarily continue to be paid for. And that there was a huge thing around marriage and preparing the girl for marriage. And so there's a lot of dynamics wrapped up into that. And that because there was also connected with that, wanting to protect the girl's reputation, her day ends up being very structured, whether it's inside or outside the house. So even if she's going to Western school and Islamic school, like those are huge chunks of time, and then she's coming home. And so we're still in the process of like figuring out concepts, which will then be taken in a couple weeks and tested through like either prototyping or co-design participant feedback workshops with the girls. But what we're finding is that there might be a bunch of different strategies, everything from programmatic ones that basically allow you to create a safe space anywhere, whether it's in your home or in Islamic school or Western school, to things where you might actually create a space to house an activity that seems like it came out of a need that they had that isn't necessarily being represented. But it's still like, how do you have to fit it within the context of their lives, right? You can't just create a new space and say, hey, this is for you girls to be empowered. And there's also a whole thing about like empowering girls, and that might be seen negatively because you are upsetting the traditional hierarchy. So how do you also build support amongst the Islamic teachers and the parents? And so it's like considering all of these things and like designing a process that also someone like Pop Council or DIFID would be able to take on and do themselves, like so that it's not just about having to have the design every single step, but it's really we're designing a framework with the lens to these are the kind of forces that affect a girl's life. And this is what you need to be cognizant of if you're rolling out an activity. Yeah, just a little bit. So I think I saw, was there someone over here who had a, no? Okay, so we'll go here and then.
Thank you for sharing everything you did. It's very amazing.
Thank you.
Do you ever find yourself maybe thinking about cross-collaborating some of your ideas? I feel like a lot of the things that you've designed can have homes in various situations, and it would be beautiful to see that hybrid.
And what do you mean by?
So like using the houses that you built that were constructed with I'm drawing blanks right now, with recycled materials, and bringing that to the situation where you're working with empowering women and creating shelters and homes, but using that system as well, so that you're hybriding like the amazing thought process and design process that you've already used, and then refining it so that there's a longer life to what you're doing.
Right. Yeah, I think you didn't necessarily explain them as part of these processes, but I think there's definitely, I mean, you know, as we were doing the co-design workshop, there were things that had been deployed in both the Tanzania and the Kenya projects that we were like, oh, well, we did it this way, and here's a strategy, or what we saw, how women related to things, or how to facilitate a conversation that happens. Or with some of the salvage stuff, I didn't show, like I've done a bunch of kind of exhibition work that's kind of about getting people in the community to come in contact with various issues and relate to one another. And basically a lot of the salvage work has found its way into that because it's a really great part of creating a tactile experience and tangibility, but with some memory. So I think they spill into, they may not become major parts of the work, but they become part of a language of design each time I do one of these things, and then that continues to build. So, you know, by the time you got to some of the projects from IDEO.org, they were actually infused with some of the things that had happened at public architecture and so on. So, yeah, they're working their way in little ways.
Curious to know more about the water project that you did, and was it derived from your research that people are going to be ready to buy safe water? So there were two issues. One, I'm assuming that in the society that they were not accustomed to buying water. I mean, water was accessible, and the second one would be that how did you build that trust that this water is indeed safe enough? It's clean.
So in answer to the first question, actually there was barely any free water to be had in the country. Like, even if you were getting it from the government kiosk, you were paying for water. So there was already a sort of institutional thing about buying water, and if you were poor, there were very few opportunities to be able to buy clean water for less than, 200, 300 Kenyan shillings, which is like a lot of money if you're like living on very little. So there was already that built in, and what we felt that we could do as a social enterprise, but also so both getting something that could ultimately be sustainable as a business, but also addressing a need, was provide water at a price that people could actually afford to do it, even if you were poor. Because oftentimes what would end up happening is then if you did drink clean water, you were using money for fuel, which is super expensive, to boil the water, or you were using it for chlorine tablets. So the money was coming out either way. So to be able to get in, not worry about it, and just be able to pour it, there was actually a value to that if it could be affordable. And then for the trust, that was one of the big questions we had. We were like, okay, if you're a new business, you're saying you're selling clean water, is anyone going to believe you and buy it? And so that's why we ran the prototypes. And what we found were there were lots of little cues that people responded to. So, the white jerry cans was a complete accident. We wanted blue, but they didn't have enough blue for us to be able to do it. We thought, blue, water, cool, it'll make it work. So we had to do white. But white ended up, when we interviewed people after, so as they buy things, we would interview them, white symbolized pure. And so to them, that was a cue that this water was clean. And then we found that people would ask us how the water process was cleaned, and if we could explain that to them. And at one prototype, we even developed like a little brochure you could hand out to them that had sort of, what the process actually, we got clean water from filtered water from the grocery store, but we showed them what a filtering process looks like. And they were like, oh, okay, great. Trusted that. And then one of the things we ended up saying for the design of the pilot is find a building space, and so it was on that graphic, of basically find a building space where you can do a little cutout that people can actually see the purification tanks, because they really do want to see that process, and that is like a cue that tells them, okay, the water coming out of there is clear. Or you offer to sterilize the cans, which we said both if you bought it at the center or if you had home delivery, that would be a cue to be able to do it. And then finally, whenever we would mention Unilever, people perked up, because Unilever had been in the country for so long that it was seen as having some trust. So if we had said the NGO, they may not have trusted us, but we said Unilever, and it was like, boom, okay, I trust that this water is clean. Now, that's a completely cultural thing, because in doing this work for Nigeria, if you mention a corporation or government, all of those things are corrupt. And so actually, if you said that an NGO is the one running it, then people are like, oh, okay, that's good. We trust that. So that's a country-by-country thing. But in the case of that Kenya project, that became how people said, okay, we understand that you guys are legit. And I think also the fact that we had completely designed things. It wasn't like we set up a lemonade stand. We designed the shirts, we designed the little bags and everything. And so they trusted that we were a real live company, and we looked different. And that ended up symbolizing trust to people. Any other questions? Okay, thank you guys so much.